The Waypoint. Chapter 4. Time had passed quickly through the valleys. The hilltops had rustled their way into a deep emerald green. The spring blossoms had come and gone, leaving fruit in their wake. Along the edge of the beautiful Willow Bay, the trees shivered and shook. The rim of the forest line quivered with untold horrors as they did their best to keep the darkness away. The boughs shifted uneasily as they did everything in their power to shield Willow Bay from the phantom hound, drifting ever closer to them as if onto some unknown scent. A new wind had entered the game. From the safety of the waypoint, Chester caught bits and pieces of murmured conversation passed between regulars and drifting strangers who'd been blown in on a chance breeze. Things that sent a chill down his spine. He'd catch whispers while serving, things that made him wonder about others walking the cobblestone streets around him. He hadn't really noticed any certain newness while navigating. Not at first. But then, he hadn't been spending as much time in spy games. By the time he was coming or going from his new apprenticeship, he was too exhausted to really pay attention to anything. It wasn't until nearly 3 weeks into his new routine that Chester started feeling the weight of the tension building above the whispers. Arguments and scuffles began breaking out in the streets more often, popping out around him while he made his way to and fro between home and the merry pub, each reflecting and bringing to mind his previous misunderstanding with the accusatory shopkeep. He never stuck around long enough to see what the root of the issue was, mostly because he knew how poorly he'd felt to the crowd surrounding him. It was always the same setup. A few at the center of attention, and a crowd surrounding, cheering, scolding, making noise over it for no other reason than, well, who knew? Each one seemed to have their own. If Buck had taught him anything, it was not to assume anything unless you'd proven it for yourself. Everything else with a grain of salt. Eventually, if they're worth their weight, they all add up to what we call seasoning. Buck had taught him a lot of things within the first month. Chester felt right at home inside the waypoint, almost immediately. The moment he entered into its heavy oak front door, the mood changed, shifting away from whatever might have happened in the streets to an attitude of kinship and joy. The place was plumb full of good aromas and crackling warmth. With all things considered, it would have been difficult to maintain anything but good cheer and communion in the ambience of the space Buck had provided. Each day brought some new adventure, from memorizing patrons' names, favored dishes, and drinks. It had turned into something of a game. Once Chester had found what good humor Buck's customers always seemed to be in, a lot of the weight fell from his shoulders. Even when given a hard time, he could see they were only kidding with him. Even those bearing what seemed to be bad news eventually laughed it off, simply shrugging and lifting their glasses to another day well fought through. Fought. The word had caught the young master's attention. Chester was quick, and the spirit of adventure and curiosity glittered and twinkled in his expression, expanding across his entire face the moment anyone started piping a story over anything. The boy was a different brand, and Buck was happy to have him. He took the jesting from the gruffer folk just fine, and over time had even begun to toss his own jokes back, leaving those around him hooting and hollering after him as he scurried on to whatever task was at hand. He was a hard worker to boot, and it had been decided above his head he was a good, if a little soft around the edges, kid. Always eager and driven nearly mad with the desire to be his best. Each of them secretly enjoyed having the little tyke around, for the fact that he reminded each a lot of themselves, when they'd still been bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Chester could almost see the glimmer returning to their shining eyes as they would speak of those times. When Nessy would return from her rounds, the two would jump into chores and swap stories. Chester would tell her all the best notes over what had been talked about between patrons, and Nessy would return with whatever stories Grandy had for the day, along with any adventure that may have met her while she was out. In no time at all, they'd become fast friends and great accomplices in whatever task they would set their minds to. The Waypoint was a safe haven, that was for sure. Chester was grateful to have stumbled on the oasis, and in such an unforeseeable way. It made him wonder if each of the blistering conversations he witnessed in passing boiled down to something wonderful for one party or the other, while the other was left with the lesson to do whatever they would with. He often fell asleep grateful over the chance of it all. One brisk morning, Chester had woken after tossing and turning all night. Dreams had kept him restless, and finally it was time to call the game quits. He quickly dressed himself for the day, wrapping a dark neck scarf as a final ornament before rushing quietly over the stairs. After making sure he'd left everything in order, he slipped from the front door into the frost-coated streets. He'd grown to love the cold mornings. He watched his breath rising to greet the twinkling stars. No one was around. The isolated silence rang peacefully to greet him. Chester caught the echo of two doves cooing back and forth as he rushed beneath their seats on top of the buildings. He flung both arms out without thinking as he navigated a swift turn in the cobblestone. For the first time in several days, his mind wandered to the little bluebird the lady in the woods had begun telling him about. He'd been so busy learning the ways of his new apprenticeship, he hadn't had much time to pay attention to anything else. By the time his head hit the pillow each night, he was already halfway into his dreams. Most nights, anyway. He crinkled his nose at the last night's rough sleep. He took in a deep breath around the final turn, and caught the pungent smells of butter, yeast, and cinnamon resting on the still air. One of these days, I'll get here in time to beat him. Chester tossed the challenge into the wind he stirred as he picked up speed, closing the gap between he and his destination in no time. The pots bubbled their hellos and how-do-you-dos in endless unison as Chester entered through the front door. The fire tickled the cauldron's fat bellies, licking up around the outside to the open tops as if to cry boo and expose them to the liquid they'd heated to a steady giggle. He crossed the open dining hall and tossed his old backpack onto the countertop. "Good morning, Buck," he called, pushing through the wooden swinging doors with both hands. They swooshed and whooshed in his wake. "Good morning, lad," the giant boomed back. Chester made his way around the island countertop, full of steaming goods. He found his way to Buck's side and then shimmied to the far side of the cauldron the barkeep was looming above. His bare paws rested at either side of his hips as he stared into it. There was a look of concern etched into the crow's feet, gathering at the corners of his eyes. "What are you making?" I'm fixin' up a new brew, little fella." He smiled, but his eyes stayed far away for a moment longer than his words. "I'm gonna need you to do something different today, Master Chester." Buck took up the wooden paddle and stirred the heavy pot. Chester stuck his nose as close to the hot steam rolling from it as he dared. It smelled soft and slightly sweet, with honey or flowers or something. He nodded, wiping the moisture building at the tip of his nose. "Sure, whatever you need, Buck." The idea of doing something new excited Chester. He went to the island and picked out 2 cinnamon rolls. They were Buck's favorite. He took his place at the other side of the cauldron and handed one of the pastries to the barkeep. He took it gratefully. "Our little lass is a bit under the weather today," he began. His eyes saddened as he stirred, but only for a moment before the spark danced back into place. "Little Ness will not be going to take Miss Grandy her rolls and baked goods today." Buck looked around the kitchen, as if for something specific, before his eyes rested on the coat standing by the back exit that led into a narrow alleyway. "Before I ask any more of you, kiddo, I'll be needing you to go and check under the coat you left last week." "Sorry, Buck. I'll be sure to take it home with me tonight." "Don't think of it, boy. That wasn't the point. It's what's under it that I want you to see." His smile widened. "There's a reason you left it, I reckon. We just don't know what it is yet." He stirred the boiling pot for a moment in silence before swinging the cauldron arm it was attached to bring it out of the flame. "Well, anyway, since Ness is out for the day, I'll need you to run her errands." Chester's heart skipped a beat. Would he finally be able to finish the story they'd started? Buck chuckled. His face lightened. "All right, boy, don't get too excited. I might get to thinking you don't like the work I got for you around here," he joked. No, not that at all. I'm just excited to see Grandy, that's all," Chester defended. All right. Well, you know the ones to gather up. And if you wouldn't mind doing what I told you to do first, and then getting into it, I'll be back to work myself." He winked, sending his young apprentice scooting across the floor toward the coat rack at the exit. Now, burning with curiosity, he lifted the coat to find a wonderfully woven, soft leather and forest green satchel. Its wondrous reflection glinted in the boy's eyes as he drank it in. "Little Nessy told me you lost yours when I sent you out last time. Figured the least I could do is make you a new one. Sorry it took me some time to replace it." "You?" Chester breathed out, examining the handiwork. "You made this, Buck? This is mine?" he rasped, tearing up. It was the best gift he'd ever received. "That's yours, boy. Now stiffen that lip and get to gettin'." He chuckled. His eyes sparkled with the same jolly laughter he let loose. Chester squeezed the material in his hands before slinging it over his shoulder. The bag felt weightless. It was almost as if it anticipated his every move somehow. He rushed and leapt and bounded his way to the countertop full of baked goods, testing it out. His old satchel had been well broken in, just as he'd liked it. It had served him well, but any time he'd gone out with the intention of sneaking around for his games of hide and seek, the bag would rub and toss back and forth defiantly, bumping and sometimes rattling against his leg to potentially expose his position. This one, however, was more like an archer's quiver than a messenger bag. Chester laughed out gleefully. "Buck, it's wonderful! You really made this?" Buck roared, his laughter echoing over the walls as the first of their daily customers rang through the front entrance, singing their usual tunes and a few whistling in the background. "You seem surprised, boy. If I wasn't so sure of myself, I might be offended in your lack of confidence in my craftsmanship." No, not surprised. More just wondering what you're not good at." Chester wrinkled his nose in a way only a childlike spirit could make unoffensive. "Why do you go to my father for anything at all if you can make stuff like this?" Chester asked. He looked over his shoulder while collecting Grandy's baked goods. Buck smiled and shook his head. "It's about more than that, boy." He pulled a ladle from its place and dipped a few helpings from the steaming pot to a large mug. Chester stayed quiet, waiting for his mentor to finish the thought. When he didn't, the boy piped in again. Is that for Nessy? Is it a medicine of some kind?" The questions rolled out together, attached at the hip. "It is for Nessy, and of sorts, I suppose it is. Medicine for the spirit as much as anything else." He chuckled as he placed the mug on a tray with some crackers and small bits of cheese. "This bit is for the little lass, but the rest is for the patrons. Just something special to tide 'em over while I get the rest of their dailies together. I think everyone could use a little lift in their spirits these days, and I think this is just the trick." Chester nodded in agreement, soaking in the comforting aroma. He nodded again, remembering what he'd noticed in the streets, the squabbling, the accusations, the rebuttal defenses spewed publicly. "Is Ness all right?" Chester asked, wondering if the concern etched over his mentor's face had been over her or something else. "She will be, lad. She needs rest. Rest and warmth is all." He mumbled the last part under his breath. Chester felt a prick of confusion, but when Buck had said all he had to say, he wasn't to be pushed. "Well, I'll get these to Grandy and be back as soon as I can. Thanks again for the new bag, Buck. I'll take great care of it." Buck looked at his young helper. "Aye, I believe it. And it'll do the same for you in return, boy." His eye twinkled. "And take your time with the Lady of the Woods. She spends too much time on her own with those animals. You can go ahead and tell her I said so." He winked. "Now off with you, lad." Chester finished wrapping the last of the rolls and rushed for the back door. "See you later, Buck. Good luck out there." "Luck is for the weak, boy. Never wish me that." He laughed boisterously and merrily waved his protege along. To be continued. Hey, thank you for tuning in for this chapter of The Waypoint. If you enjoyed this content and would like to support the channel or see content become more frequent, please feel free to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Thanks for joining in, and I will see you next time.